Ivor Chipkin, who will be introduced by our clerk.
Apologies for the earlier blunder. As indicated, Professor Ivor Chipkin will now be speaking to us on state capture, or rather leading evidence on state capture and state-owned enterprises.
Thank you, Professor.
Do I look at you?
Yes,
Do I face you? Okay.
you can look at me and the panel. Could you begin by telling us your qualifications and your experience in the area, and a little bit about the background to the report, The Betrayal of Promise, which was prepared by the Public Affairs Institute and other organizations. This report is available online and it is also part of the packs given to the panel.
So my name is Ivor Chipkin. I'm the director of the Public Affairs Research Institute, which is a research institute based at Wits University. And what we study is questions of public administration. We look at government. We apply social science methods to get into government departments and figure out how they're structured, who they staff, what the cultures are, and ultimately what they
sorry, if you'll help us and slow down the rate at which you speak slightly, because some of us are challenged in some ways.
I will slow down. I will certainly slow down. So we're an institute that works on government and how government works. We try to get into departments and interview people and do historical work as well. And from 2014, which we had developed some strong familiarity with a whole range of key departments, including the South African Revenue Services and several others. And we started noticing that there were purges going on in many state institutions. So it starts in the South African Revenue Services at the end of 2014. Similar things are happening in the Hawks, and the NPA it started a little bit earlier. And in that context, our work started to try to get drawn into understanding what was driving these purges which are happening in government. At the same time, a lot of our work, Professor Sitolo, or Dr. Sitolo was mentioning the scale of outsourcing which has happened in the state. A lot of that evidence comes from PARI's work, and what we've been finding was that government essentially has been working over since 2000 in particular through outsourcing. Huge introduction of what's called the new public management, which involved masses of outsourcing of government's work to private companies. So we started noticing that there was drama happening in the state-owned enterprises, and then there was these purges happening in state institutions, and it's in that context that we started to investigate what later became known as the phenomenon of state capture. I should point out that the betrayal report is not a PARI report per se. It's a report that comes out of a collaboration between PARI at Wits University, Mark Swilling's outfit at the University of Stellenbosch, the Center for Complex Systems in Transition, and also with the involvement of Harim Borat from the University of Cape Town and also colleagues from UJ. So it really is a cross-institutional collaboration.
The report sets the framework for state capture and tries to provide a conceptual way in which we can understand state capture from a theoretical basis and how it's operating today. Can you speak to some of the terms that we see when discussing this issue, such as what is state capture? Yes. Is there even a definition we can use?
Yes. So, and I think this is what's important to understand in this process, but also for the report. We are not journalists, and we are not investigators in any ordinary sense. What we were academics. And what we tried to bring to the study or the analysis of state capture was an academic perspective. And what we were trying to do was we were trying to analyze phenomena. So what we were drawing on was lots and lots of evidence that was already gathered from other sources, including the heroic and extraordinarily courageous work of the independent journalists in South Africa, like, for example, the people based at Amabongani and later Daily Maverick, that have done really outstanding work in telling us some of the stories which now form the heart of what we understand as state capture. But we also correlated those stories with huge bodies of other information which were already in the public domain. Government reports, legal documents from government processes. There have been some very important civil society organizations that have been taking government departments and officials to court, and affidavits arising from that process. We've drawn on all of that material. The South African government despite certain stereotypes of it, actually puts huge amounts of data in the public domain already. So we were able to draw on huge amounts of evidence already in the public domain. And what we did was, we tried to analyze this information together. It's in that context that we started to develop what we think was a novel vocabulary for state capture, and a whole lot of terms we introduced which I think have entered the kind of the ordinary day, the everyday of South African political language. What we argued essentially was that we argued that there had been a silent coup in South Africa, the emergence of what we called a shadow state, and essentially what we meant by shadow state wasn't a coup d'etat in an ordinary sense of a group seizing power militarily. What we were able to show, and I'm absolutely convinced by it, and I think the Gupta leaks which came out after our report just give further and further evidence to corroborate it, was that political power was increasingly seeping out of constitutional bodies. It was seeping away from Parliament. It was seeping out of Cabinet. Decision-making was happening outside of the formal apparatuses and formal institutions, and increasingly happening in what we called kitchen cabinets, but increasingly happening in private forum amongst individuals that had no mandate to be taking those individuals. The Guptas are the most famous of them, but there were many other sorts of people like this which we describe as part of this process. And in describing that kind of informalization of political power in South Africa, we used the term of a power elite, the emergence of a power elite. So we used this notion of a shadow state. We talked about a power elite, and we argued that the way in which this power elite was functioning essentially was by what we called repurposing state institutions. In other words, by using government departments, or in particular state-owned enterprises. I think we were the first to start focusing on state-owned enterprises, using state-owned enterprises with a specific legal, constitutional, and operational mandate, and twisting those organizations to serve a different purpose to what they were originally established. And we call that repurposing. I'm encouraged to see that lots of that language has entered the everyday of political lexicon. I even saw, to my horror, Helen Zille justifying her colonialism tweets by claiming that the Singapore government had repurposed colonial institutions for a post-colonial purpose. So I think that language has really entered the wide discourse.
And in your view, would the distinction between corruption as we have known it and the idea of state capture, is the difference that seeping of power out of institutions and the overarching aim to ultimately derive long-term financial benefits rather than individual instances or transactions?
You see, I think we have to be very careful, and this is what I would insist on, and I would encourage this process to be aware of. Certain ways in which we frame, and I know these terms this is controversial and it's difficult for all of us to come to terms with it. If we frame state capture in terms of corruption solely, what we're essentially doing is that we're looking for which is what we have been doing and what we have been finding, there's abundant evidence, but essentially we're reducing the phenomenon of state corruption to a criminal phenomenon. That what you're dealing with here is a group of criminals, a network of criminals, a gangsters, a gang, that have somehow amazingly seized power of the state and have looted it for their own purposes. Now, there is masses and masses of evidence to suggest that is what has been going on, and that suggests, therefore, a policing action is absolutely needed. Those people need to be caught, they need to be prosecuted, and if they're found guilty, they need definitely to go to jail. But that perspective on state capture, which reduces it to criminality, and this is really what the report was arguing very, very strongly, obscures that something else very, very dramatic and important is going on, that there is a politics behind state capture. And this is what the betrayal report was trying to understand. We were arguing that there was a way of making sense of what was going on, and that is what we call the politics. And making sense at two levels. There was an ideology operating here. So we'll see state capture play itself out in a very particular way. It focuses on state-owned enterprises and leveraging those state-owned enterprises, and in particular their procurement budgets, to create a new kind of economy. So there's a particular ideology around how you use the state, but underpinning it, and I think this is for me the key finding, and I'd really like this to be part of the considerations of this panel, is a conviction, which is at the heart, I think, many of us share this, or have shared it, and I think it's wrong, fundamentally wrong conviction, that there's something wrong with our transition and that there's something wrong with our constitution. That ultimately the constitution has been an obstacle to radical change in South Africa, and therefore it has been legitimate to violate the constitution and to break the law. And I think that sentiment is ultimately what underpins state capture. So what the betrayal report was trying to do was saying, yes, there's huge amounts of criminality going on here. We need to identify it and we need to stop it. But we need to recognize that this is happening within or facilitated by a political context which is nourished by a whole range of political ideas. And we have to confront those ideas.
And is that finding by the report in relation to state capture generally, or state capture pre-94 and in the future, and in relation to the different kinds of identities and parties who have captured the state? And I'd like to raise, for example, white monopoly capital as another entity who some say have also worked towards capturing the state.
So I think this is it's a fundamental question, and I think this is why we use the notion of the betrayal of the promise. I think state capture or apartheid era corruption is by definition is ambivalent to democracy. It is the interplay between private sector and the South African government in the service of the apartheid project, in the service of maintaining and reproducing a system of racial domination and of racial violence and of class exploitation. That is its purpose. It is by definition an anti-democratic project. The hope of 1994, of course, is that we had fundamentally interrupted that logic of government and that way of behaving in government, that we had constituted a new constitutional dispensation, that from then on we will have elected governments that will operate within the framework of the Constitution and in the spirit of democracy. So I think the arms deal, for example, again, I would want to differentiate the arms deal in the 1990s to current phenomena, because I don't think the arms deal is driven by a politics of violating the Constitution and of violating the democracy. I think from 2010, 2011, we find, I think, overwhelming evidence that the project of state capture that we have been witnessing is a project which is fundamentally committed to weakening the constitutional framework in South Africa. It is a political project that regards the Constitution as a major obstacle to economic transformation, and therefore is prepared to violate its spirit and violate its laws and violate its processes. And I think that is what distinguishes it from other kinds of corruption and abuse of earlier periods. So in this sense, it's a lot like apartheid era corruption, but it's shockingly different in the sense that this is occurring in the age when we thought we have defeated the apartheid project.
Well, if I can pick up on that, what would you say are the commonalities between the kinds of conduct that has been happening in the past and that may well happen in the future? If we can't call it state capture, does it have elements of state capture, and if so, which ones, and which ones run through?
Sorry, just to clarify, which does what have elements of state capture? So there are different ways of thinking around state capture. The most widely accepted sort of definition, which I think has real value, is to think of state capture as political elites writing the rules of government in such a way that they serve themselves. So that state capture, therefore, can be distinguished from straightforward corruption in that state capture can happen legally. You can write the rules, including the laws and the regulations, to serve your own economic interests, but you do it legally, so that it looks as if this project of accumulation is happening in and through the constitutional environment. And I think that's definitely the project of apartheid. That is definitely what's happening in apartheid, and therefore one could apply the term state capture to what's happening in the through the apartheid period, and especially during the period of actually not from the mid-1980s. I think the apartheid project is much more prone to straightforward criminality. And I think there's a large element, but what's been interesting about, there's an element of that definition of state capture which has been playing out over the last 10 years, but undoubtedly they've not been able to write the rules to serve themselves, so they have been breaking the rules and violating the Constitution in pursuit of a particular project.
So could you provide us with an overview of the structure of state capture as the theory that the report posits as to how state capture generally operates?
Yes, I think just to keep this in mind, I think we have to recognize that some of the key players are doing this, I think, in good faith. I think Malusi Gigaba undoubtedly at the center of the state capture project, but I think unless there's other evidence in the public domain to which I'm not aware, I would imagine that he's doing this in good faith. I don't think there's huge evidence. I don't think there's evidence that he's corrupt. But he's undoubtedly an engineer of this. But I think he's doing it in good faith, and this is where I think this arises. I think we have to recognize that the current phenomena starts in 2007 at the Polokwane Conference of the African National Congress. And I think it emerges in the context of a fundamental repudiation of the politics of Thabo Mbeki. And I think this is why Jacob Zuma is able to marshal the kind of alliances and support he is from the trade unions, from the Communist Party and other parts of the African National Congress, profoundly disillusioned with the politics of Thabo Mbeki. And the disillusionment after 2007 is in a specific area. It's in the economic policies of the African National Congress and the sense of the degree to which those policies have reproduced historical patterns of ownership and control of the economy. That yes, we have economic growth during the Mbeki years, as it turns out the fastest economic growth we've had in 30, 40 years, but it's an economic growth which reproduces the historical patterns of apartheid, especially large-scale, what is associated with is large-scale and massive economic exclusion for ordinary South Africans. People living in informal settlements, people living in townships, people living in rural areas, massively excluded by this model of economic growth. What you start seeing after 2007, therefore, is the search, I think again, and I must insist again, in good faith, for more radical models of economic transformation. A sense that this kind of political economy which we've had through the 1990s is absolutely unsustainable. And therefore you see a search for a more radical concept of transformation. And you see it, for example, it starts in the ANC Youth League. We start hearing this term radical economic transformation. In the Youth League, though, it's associated with a return to a vision of the Freedom Charter, of nationalizing the leading heights of the economy, and that becomes the major platform of the economic freedom fighters when they eventually leave the ANC. But elsewhere in the ANC, but especially within government itself and in various organized black business forums, other models of radical economic transformation are beginning to emerge. They largely inspired by an idea of Afrikaner economic transformation in the post-war period. And what they're looking for is a recognition that nationalization doesn't really work. They're looking for a model which accepts the principle of a market economy to some extent.
You have begun to speed up again automatically.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. I will slow down again. Maybe a red flag to moderate my pace would be appropriate. The idea that is beginning to develop is that one can use state-owned enterprises, in particular their procurement budgets, and we find a fantastic document from 2010 from the Department of Trade and Industry. It's the first time we see the printed use of the term radical economic transformation, and it lists the procurement budgets of all the state-owned enterprises, and there's a figure of, if I'm correct, 210 billion rand per annum, which can be used, and here's the key point, it can be used to create a new class of black-owned and black-controlled industrial enterprises. So by using government's industrial spend, and they're focusing particularly on Transnet and Eskom, one can create a new black-owned and black-controlled economy. And one can understand that these are very, very inspiring, and these are very, very compelling ideas. And it goes back to the repudiation of Thabo Mbeki, where the project of black economic empowerment was really based on kind of cajoling, encouraging, pressurizing, trying to persuade white businesses to transform themselves. And here you have a model of economic transformation that says, well, white businesses are inherently racist. They're not going to transform. Here is a model of economic transformation that doesn't depend on white businesses and white people coming to the party. Here is a model that can use the state and use government procurement to create a whole new kind of black-owned and black-controlled economy. And I think those ideas are incredibly compelling. The problem is, very, very quickly, the project runs up against the Constitution. And we have an unusual Constitution, I think, by international standards. Section 217 of the Constitution, for example, discusses procurement, public procurement specifically. And it argues, well, it requires, doesn't argue, it requires that two principles are reconciled. One is a principle, if you like, of good value, that public procurement has to be on the basis of a good price, of experience, these sorts of things. And on the other base, and the other one is a question of transformation. The Constitution assumes that those two principles can be reconciled. In other words, that one can find and create black-owned and black-controlled enterprises that can also offer goods and services at the right price and with good value. What is emerging from the Department of Trade and Industry and from the Black Management Forum and other places is an argument, which is a strong argument, that these principles cannot ever be reconciled. Am I running ahead? Am I getting too quick again? Okay. Maybe it's a protest from the... Okay.
I see you get your signals electronically these days.
I don't need the red flag. It's the intercom, the address system that's forcing me.
Perhaps at this point, I can just draw you back to the report,
yes,
where you mentioned 7 broad areas of capture, and the first one is what you're dealing with now, which is securing control over state-owned enterprises by chronically weakening their governance and operational structures.
Right.
Now, do you think there's anything, and you're speaking now about the procurement laws, that was an area of vulnerability within SOEs. Is there any other reasons why state-owned enterprises are perhaps particularly vulnerable to this kind of interference?
Well, our state-owned enterprises are in a state of kind of institutional limbo. In their current form, they were prepared for privatization in the late 1980s by the Nationalist Party government. That was taken forward through the 1990s. And then, and the form of preparation for privatization was through a process of what we call corporatization. In other words, they weren't sold, but they were prepared for privatization by turning them into more commercial entities. That process of privatization is then halted by the huge process that unfolds in the 1990s against privatization. So it means the governance structures of state-owned enterprises are neither, what's the idiom? Fish nor fowl. And it means that particular governance structures are particularly weak as to what the role of the governing bodies are and to whom those governing bodies are accountable. So it's made, and you'll see that a lot of the political interference in the state-owned enterprises has happened through through regular board changes, which are political processes done through by the relevant minister. And there, Minister Gigaba, when he was the Minister of Public Enterprises, and later Lynn Brown, have played key roles in bringing in Gupta-aligned persons into the boards of these enterprises.
Those appointments of directors for the boards of SOEs, are those directly aligned with the political objectives and ideology you've been highlighting, or are they one step removed?
So, I have to be honest here, I think we don't fully understand this. It's quite mysterious. If you take, for example, Transnet, which we're currently working on in preparation for the portfolio committee hearings on state capture. So the parliamentary process comes out of the betrayal report. Our group did the ESCOM piece, and now we're doing the Transnet piece. It's, that first Transnet board is appointed by Gigaba, and it looks like it's appointed by people that are in line with this ideology of radical economic transformation. Dan Mkwanazi comes out of the Black Management Forum and others. They're clearly in line, and I think there's a certain idealism which is at play here. But the later rejigging of those boards are bringing in Gupta-aligned people, and it's very, very difficult at this stage to understand what is going on here. My sense is that there are two things going on here. One is that the project is getting criminalized in a straightforward way. The other one is that the project is in the first place about breaking the hold of white companies in these fields of the economy, irrespective of who replaces them. If they're nominally black, like a Gupta company would be regarded as nominally black, that is maybe good enough. And maybe this is a kind of a deeply cynical project in the sense that they've reduced their idealism of bringing in and creating new black-owned and black-controlled firms. And what this is really about, is that in the first place, is about breaking the hold of white companies in those sectors. But that relationship remains a very complex one. And I have to tell you that the report has been controversial in South Africa for making this political argument, when there is so much evidence to suggest that actually what we're dealing with here is a straightforward criminal phenomenon. I know that Henny, for example, gets sometimes quite angry with me when I stress the political as opposed to the criminal.
The report gives a generalized model of the patronage networks that operate in state capture. Can you talk to that?
We were playing with some ideas around how this could work. And what we saw, what we tried to distinguish in those networks between, which was coming out of sort of international literature around around international corruption, was distinguishing between, what was the language we were using? Fixers, a network of fixers who would make the deals, and then those who would control, who would instruct them politically. So we drew a diagram of the controllers, their relationship to political elites. And then and essentially what we were arguing was here, there's the Guptas and a whole range of other people like them. These were fixers, these were controllers, these were people that acted out, who carried out political instructions from what we call the kitchen cabinet, where the process was controlled politically by key politicians centered on Jacob Zuma and people around him. We argue and we think that what later happens is that the people that are originally brought in to kind of facilitate some of the deals, they start acquiring more and more political authority within these processes, and eventually they start to become what we call the controllers themselves. So they start off as kind of middlemen, facilitating the deals, making possible certain transactions, and eventually we think what happens is that their power and authority increases to such a degree that eventually they are the people offering, obviously, Jonas a position as the Minister of Finance. So they become controllers, if you like. I think that relationship is always fundamentally unstable, and this is again what we have to be aware of. If we don't address the larger political context in which this phenomenon is happening, and we, for example, achieve and get rid of the Guptas and even manage to get them in jail, this logic remains, which means there are lots of other people willing to play this role as fixers in a political process. And there have been lots of other fixers and controllers in South Africa. I think Shabir Sheikh played that role. The Durban crowd plays that role. Pandey Pillay has played that role. There's an Alexandra crowd that are wanting to play that role. There are lots of various people that are willing to play this kind of fixer role, controller role, in the service of political networks. So getting rid of the Guptas doesn't address that particular political constellation.
So your opinion is that although we focus now on the Guptas, and that is the politically intense issue of the moment, the theory and the general idea of state capture and how the patronage network can and will work is something that may well operate once the Guptas have left South Africa, and it may well operate in the future with new administrations and new political parties in power.
Absolutely. As long as we allow us to continue to believe that there's something wrong with our constitution, as long as we allow a possibility that it's legitimate for political leaders to pursue economic policies in violation of the law and in violation of the constitution, this kind of process continues to be a real possibility. And there'll just be new players, there'll just be new names, but it'll be the same kind of logic.
But would you accept that there is an appropriate role for the state to play in the direction and guidance of state-owned enterprises and how they operate in South Africa? As the 100% shareholder?
Oh, completely. I mean, in my mind, the argument, there's a hands-down, no-brainer argument for a role for the state in the generation of electricity, for example. There's a huge role for the state to play an important part in the economy, given the legacy of apartheid and the scale of violence and discrimination which has happened. So this is not a call for kind of free market model or where the state steps out. This is a call for the state to play the role which it is mandated to play constitutionally.
So your view is the state must play the role, but within the bounds of the Constitution. Where it steps outside of that, that's where state capture comes into play.
I think that's exactly right.
If we can move on from the more general abstract idea of state capture and look at what is one of the focuses of the report, which is the Gupta network. And the report shows the modus operandi of the Gupta network in a number of instances. And this tribunal will look at one such case, and tomorrow we will deal with a number of the facts around Denel and the transactions and it had entered into. But could you perhaps explain or give some insight into how the report has seen the way in which the Guptas have infiltrated state and removed power? We are just having a microphone battery replacement moment.
Okay. So, again, the story is well known, but it's worth, some of the details are in the report which have not been so well reported in the public domain, and it's worth just giving a sense of the scale of rent seeking which is going on. And again, it speaks something to the logic of state capture as it manifests as a political project. So you know, for example, Brian Molefe becomes the CEO of Eskom in 2015. It's the moment when Optimum coal mine, owned by Glencore, is in dire financial straits and seeks to renegotiate its coal contract with Eskom. Optimum mine is a mine where its coal reef has dipped and is further and further away from the power stations which it's servicing. It's selling a fairly low quality coal to Eskom, and the value of the contract was historically for 325 million rand per annum. Not a huge contract, but again, low quality coal. Under Brian Molefe, there is a process of forcing the Optimum coal mine into bankruptcy. They won't renegotiate that coal contract with Glencore, and they force the Optimum coal mine into bankruptcy. And in and through that process, they bring in new buyers, and the new buyers are the Guptas through a company called Tegeta, which they own. And the deal is facilitated by our current Minister of Mines, Zwane, who's come from the Free State. Of course, you know, the dairy project he was involved in with the Gupta family. He has strong Gupta links, and he facilitates the sale of Optimum Mine from Glencore to Tegeta, owned by the Guptas. What is astonishing, and I think that speaks to the logic again of breaking the hold of established white firms in that coal mining space and bringing in new black-owned and black-controlled companies. We can wonder whether Tegeta is a good example of a black-owned and black-controlled company, but nonetheless it speaks to the logic of this process. What is just astonishing is the illegality of the whole project. First of all, Tegeta does not have the money to buy the mine. So the money is effectively loaned by Eskom to Tegeta to buy the asset so that it can sell the coal to Tegeta. I don't know the details, but I understand from people in National Treasury that it violates a whole host of laws in the structuring of deals. What we do see in 2016 is something quite astonishing. We see the value of that contract between Eskom and Tegeta now go from 325 million per annum to, and remember, it's the same pile of low quality coal. The value of the contract goes from 325 million per annum to over 7 billion rand per annum. The same pile of coal that has been costing Eskom 325 million rand is now costing Eskom 7 billion rand. And of course that goes into the cost of which Eskom is charging us for electricity. What we think, but we don't know conclusively, although there's new evidence beginning to emerge, large sums of that money are passing through we identify 18 companies, which are money is swashing between various accounts between these 18 companies, and then the money is either ending up in Hong Kong or in Dubai. So very substantial amounts of that money coming from Eskom, coming from us because we're paying for electricity, is ending up in overseas accounts. It may well be coming back via other channels, but nonetheless, a huge amount is leaving the country. And this is, I think, is a hugely important point here. This is a project of economic transformation, which is deeply, deeply damaging to key state institutions, deeply damaging, but is also seeing huge amounts of economic value leaving the country. There are so many other stories which we can tell.
Perhaps you can use some more examples in responding to this question. What, in your view and in the view of the report, were the oversight mechanisms and constitutional constraints that actually did work to rein in state capture, and which were the ones that were effectively sidestepped by actors in these instances?
Well, I think, and I think this tribunal is part of that process, and I think we have to, and that's why I'm very honored to be part of this process, and I think we have to celebrate processes like this. Because in the current situation, two institutions have largely, one is held and one has been reinvigorated, and that is the higher courts. I think the magistrates' courts in South Africa are still in very, very troubled terrain, but the higher courts, the Supreme Courts, the high courts, and of course the Constitutional Court has played, I think, an outstanding role in this regard. But it's largely been the activism of civil society organizations that has brought us to this point. Political parties, of course, have played an important role in Parliament, but it's been the activism of various civil society organizations, including the Helen Suzman Foundation and Freedom Under Law, the Save South Africa campaign, which was the largest gathering of civil society organizations since 1994, Save South Africa, putting thousands of people into the streets, a whole host of awkward and unfamiliar alliances of liberal organizations, the reactivation of old UDF networks, for example. So I think that is what this moment is, and I think what it shows, and it's what's brought us to this point, and this, I think, gives me great encouragement for the future, is that there's still real democratic fire in the belly of South African civil society. And civil society networks are stronger and more active than they've been before. The ties between the various organizations are alive. And I think that's very, very encouraging for the future. And I think it'll be a very helpful correction to our tendency in South Africa, in our political culture, to focus on individuals. Oh, now we've got rid of Zuma and Ramaphosa's back there, we're all saved. I think what we need to recognize that what holds South Africa, what will keep us democratic, will keep us on a progressive, transformational agenda, is the quality of the institutions which we build. And we now know that our courts are fairly solid, our civil society organizations are strong, financially vulnerable, but in organizational terms they're strong. And what we need now is, going forward, is a process of rebuilding our state institutions, and that means standing by and in solidarity with public servants and public officials who are trying to do their jobs in their various organizations.
What are the final recommendations and suggestions to resolve the current crisis, as the report puts it, and to prevent similar things happening in the future? You've mentioned a few of them now, but are there any others you'd like to talk to?
I mean, I think that for me the strongest one, and I think we have to, is an ambivalence which I think is widespread, not just within the ANC, it's in many organizations and many of our dinner table conversations, is an ambivalence to democracy and an ambivalence especially to our constitution. Somehow that our constitution is the product of a flawed transition, and it's produced, in the language of some academics, an elite pact. That the Constitution is not a progressive document, that it allows those white privileges to remain and be reproduced. I think that's a deeply flawed understanding of the Constitution. So I think the first major remedy against future state capture in the form in which we've had it is to reaffirm our commitment to the Constitution as a progressive document, as a fundamentally progressive document, not as a document which entrenches established patterns of wealth. So that would be my first, and that means ideological and political struggle against those who are saying it's not, whether it's in the academy, of which there are many people in our universities making that argument. I think it's a flawed argument in political parties, etc. I think we have to defend our Constitution as a progressive document. I think what we haven't spoken about, which the report speaks a lot about, and we're only now beginning to understand it better, is the role of the intelligence agencies. The work of the intelligence agencies and the purging and the weakening of state institutions can be felt, whether it's at SARS, whether it's at the Hawks, whether it's the NPA, whether it's in the life of government departments. Those intelligence agencies are completely out of control. We know this from Castrol's the commission which he called in the late 1990s to narrow the mandate of the intelligence agencies and to bring them under greater democratic control. That's never ever happened. I think the intelligence agencies are completely out of control. So the next step is to rein in our intelligence agencies. I think we need to recognize, I'm so glad that Kaya identified the question of outsourcing is a major incentive to this kind of corruption, or creates an environment. Because what it does mean is that I think we really need to focus on public administration, as boring as that sounds, although it's the key dimension of how government works. And we need to be thinking seriously around building and rebuilding out the state institutions that we have. And associated with that, and I think that would be my final point, is to recognize and to start to overcome a discourse and a language which says that public servants in South Africa are all somehow stupid, corrupt, and inept. There are thousands, there are tens of thousands of honest, hard-working public servants that they are the ones that have felt the real brunt of the state capture phenomenon in terms of the persecution at the level of their jobs, the insecurity they've suffered. We, as the public and as citizens of South Africa, we need to stand by honest and honorable public servants to defend them and give them solidarity in their fights in their organizations. They are under the most extraordinary political pressure on a daily basis. And I think it's our role to assist them.
Thank you, Professor Chipkin. That's all the questions from the evidence leaders, and I'll now hand over to the panel to ask for any clarifications or discussion points.
All right, thank you very much, Ivor. A couple of questions from myself. The first one is in the story that you've painted about the emergence of state capture. I just wanted to know how much you are attaching to the work of the Presidential Review Commission under Ria Piecha, which President Zuma appointed. And secondly, the move of the coordination of state-owned enterprises from the office of the Deputy President to that of the President himself.
So, I mean, the specific questions will take me a long time to address. So I think the general spirit of the questions, if I may answer it in that way, is to say that I think it's absolutely important that we think around the phenomenon of state capture, and we need to engage it or understand it in relationship to how government is structured and how government works. So the presidential review which you were talking about must be understood in relationship to the 1998 Presidential Review Commission, which makes some proposals which are never implemented. And their proposals which come out of 1998 are really about establishing or rebuilding the center of government to provide a high-level technical capacity for departments to perform their functions. It proposes, for example, a return of re-establishing the power of the Public Service Commission, of reducing the role of DPSA. And what is so important about those proposals are, what it's essentially saying is that the role which the executive has made in in making appointments in the public service, we need to rethink. And I think this is the spirit of the 1998 Commission. So the later Commission sidesteps all of those issues in my mind. And I think what the 1998 Commission was asking us to think about was whether it's appropriate, whether it remains appropriate, which I think is not appropriate any longer, that the executive authority, that politicians are responsible for appointments of public servants, which is the way the situation it is now. All public servants are potentially political appointments, and this is done by design. The executive authority, whether it's the minister or the cabinet, are responsible for the appointment of public servants. Director generals only have an HR function to the extent that it is delegated to them by the relevant minister. I think it is that environment that creates highly politicized atmospheres within departments, and I think it plays into the phenomena of state capture.
I mean, I hear the credit that you give to civil society and the role that civil society has sort of played in the fight against what we define as state capture. But there's an important civil society player, which is located at the center of state-owned enterprises, which is the union movement. What has been their role in this?
Yeah, it's interesting. And I think there you're asking a big question that's got to do with the relationship of the unions and the tripartite alliance. I think what we've seen over the last couple of years is the alliance go into fundamental crisis. I think it's weakened the ability of the unions to play an independent role to check some of the things that have been going on in the state-owned enterprises. So I think the split in the alliance, the weaknesses of COSATU has made some of the shenanigans going on in state-owned enterprises much more possible. And then that is related, of course, again, not to criminalization. I think that's got to do with the internal, had to do with the internal political struggles within the tripartite alliance. But I do think you're putting your finger on something absolutely fundamentally important.
I'm interested in whether in your research you found, I mean, if you look at the Public Protector's report on PRASA, the Transport Union, SATAU, is implicated. If you take the SABC situation, the Communication Workers Union is implicated. So I just wanted to know whether in the course of your work, did you find some of the evidence that says that the unions are themselves captured?
We haven't focused on the unions, so no.
Okay.
Just with respect to you, sir, I think that my colleague panelists know much more about that than all of us would do.
Right. Yes.
Okay, I mean the last...
I think they'll come and interview you after this process.
Because this panel is looking at the arms industry, I just wanted to know whether, I mean, it's coming tomorrow. Do you know about what happened at Dinel, the VR laser, in the course of your work, and whether you're able, now that we're here, to share some of that? I mean, it's coming up in the other hearings.
I don't remember the details. There's a little bit of it in the betrayal report. We do discuss the relationship between Dinel and the Guptas and VR laser, but I can't remember the details. But there is ongoing work on that which we're going to be involved in. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you very much for your excellent presentation. Could you give a view on whether or not, I don't think I heard you say whether or not you think that this issue is unique to South Africa? And if not, how is it being dealt with in other countries? And is there anything that South Africa can learn from it? And finally, is there a role for parliamentary subcommittees to play as well?
So I don't think this is unique to South Africa. And I think this is what's happening in South Africa is happening in the context of populist regimes around the world. So I think you have to understand what's happening in Brazil, the kind of corruption, the displacement of an elected government through claims of corruption, in the space of what's going on in Turkey, populist governments in Turkey. Certainly in India under Modi, you have very aggressive attacks on the Indian constitution in the same way that in Brazil. And I think South Africa is part of this growing skepticism among certain political elites about constitutionalism and the ability to operate to achieve economic transformation or to achieve large-scale economic change or whatever it may be within the structures of the constitution. And I think that is what makes South Africa under Jacob Zuma comparable to India's Modi, to what's happening in Turkey under Erdogan, and of course what's been going on in Venezuela and what's been going on in Brazil recently. So I would see South Africa in relationship to those broader processes. Well, parliamentary subcommittees have really come to life. So I think Parliament has been dormant for the last long time. Its preparedness to ask searching questions and then to hold the executive to account has been poor. But I think this has started to change in the course of 2017. So the Portfolio Committee, which has been investigating what's generically known as state capture, I think has been doing quite terrific work. Advocate Renara as an evidence leader on the behalf of Parliament has been terrific work from within Parliament. So we're hoping that the Transnet hearings are also going to be very revealing. So I think, of course, there's a huge role for Parliament to play, but it must be within the confines, again, of Parliament understanding that its role is to hold the executive to account. And again, recognizing that Parliament are institutions of democracy rather than in the service of a particular political party or a political ideology.
Thank you, Prof. Forgive me, my question is still all over the place in my mind, so bear with me as I try to relate it. So we are in agreement that apartheid as a system was deeply corrupt and deeply cruel, and we agree how it marginalized and excluded millions of people from benefiting from the economy of this country. And as a person who grew up in the townships, as a person who works in informal settlements, I continue to see how successful the project of apartheid has been in making sure that people from the black community in this country remain excluded and marginalized. Now, in my mind, I see how the argument about the Constitution, because we are now in a democratic South Africa ruled by the Constitution, I see how the argument about the Constitution itself being a hindrance, and please bear with me, to radical economic transformation. Because in the democratic dispensation, we still see the very same people who were marginalized under apartheid bearing the same brand in the democratic South Africa. Those are the same people that do not afford to send their kids to school because education is so expensive. These are the same people that depend on the government that is ruled by the Constitution to provide proper access to health, to education, to all of these good things that we have been excluded from for the longest time. Now we see how that has not been achieved, right? And we see how, or I see and understand why when someone comes in and says, so the Constitution was a fraud project or flawed project, because look at where you are. You are trapped in generational poverty, and the Constitution is in place. And therefore, my question is, how do we then protect the Constitution and make sure that the Constitution works for every citizen of South Africa? Where in the Constitution do we ensure that that happens? Because we see how corruption affects more than anyone the poor in this country. And there should be ways to deal with corruption in the Constitution, and I believe there are. But there should be ways in the Constitution as well to deal with the generational oppression and poverty that black people find themselves trapped in. And my discomfort with treating the Constitution as this holy book that cannot be critiqued is that I believe that any document or even ideology that sees itself as progressive should have the ability to self-critique. And if we treat the Constitution as this holy book that we cannot critique, we are trapped in this situation where some pockets of this community or this country will be progressive and will enjoy economic results in the country while others are totally excluded. So if you can help me understand where in the Constitution we can actually tap into to make sure that the historical crimes afforded black people in this country can be addressed, but also how corruption currently can be addressed. As I said, it's all over the place, but I hope you get the spirit
No, I do.
of the question.
No, and I mean, I think you know, this goes to the heart of the major challenges and dilemmas, political and intellectual dilemmas in South Africa. So I think you've given us already some very powerful clues as to how we go forward. And the distinction you make between the holy cow, treating the Constitution as a holy cow, and the notion of critiquing the Constitution. Because I think we are absolutely and must be, we're in a democracy, we're in a new democracy of critique. And I think that's absolutely legitimate and it's absolutely necessary. There are huge problems in that Constitution. I work in the space of public administration. I can tell you that Constitution is a disaster at certain levels. It makes a distinction between national government as a policy-making department and provincial departments as the kind of implementing. These are unworkable frameworks. So there's definitely the work of critique. But we also have to recognize that that work of critique must happen at the same time while we obey and operate within the framework of that Constitution. So that was the distinction I think is very, very useful. So we don't treat it as a holy cow, but we nonetheless have to accept that we live within the framework of it, and we obey that framework as we change it. But there are a couple of indications already that it's not necessarily the Constitution that is the obstacle to the kind of change that you're wanting, and I think many of us in this room are wanting. That the Constitution actually is a vehicle that will provides for that kind of change. So, for example, we know, although it's never repeated properly in the media, it's not made by political parties, we know that the Constitution does not protect private property rights in any straightforward manner. It absolutely qualifies private property rights in all sorts of ways. It provides for expropriation of land, for example. So there are lots of ideas about our Constitution as conservative and of preventing land redistribution, which are just false. So that's the one thing. We also know that there have been some incredibly important social justice organizations, whether it's the Social Justice Coalition in Cape Town, whether it's SERI, the Social Economic Rights Institute based in Johannesburg, which have won terrific battles against government in favor of poor and working communities by using the Constitution. In other words, there have been some very, very important constitutional judgments in favoring the elaboration and the extension of socio-economic rights on constitutional principles. So again, I think we have to understand that the Constitution provides a framework which allows us to achieve some of the things you're wanting. So the question is, why haven't we been able to achieve these things? And I think that's a very complicated question. In the work that I do, for example, we're starting to understand that issues of state administrations are very, very complicated. So for example, is outsourcing. If you've outsourced so much of government's work to private companies, your ability to control what they do and how they do it is lost. But it's also got to do with overcoming very, very complex and difficult histories of the transition. Take, for example, by the end of the apartheid period. By the end of the apartheid period, South Africa has effectively been broken up into 14 countries, the Bantustans. So they have no political legitimacy, but by the end of the apartheid period, they are substantial administrations. Transkei has been functioning as an independent state for almost 20 years. There's the Ciskei, there's BOP, there's all these, they have their own administrations. That history of re-amalgamating those administrations into a unitary South Africa has been unbelievably complicated and unbelievably taxing, and it has huge consequences on the ability of these administrations to perform. So just in the realm of public administration, there are complex reasons to why government hasn't been able to perform in terms and deliver on their mandates, although in some cases they have. So the problem is we short-circuit our arguments by going straight to the Constitution as the source of the problem. And I think that short-circuit is deeply misguided, and politically it's very, very dangerous.
Thank you, Professor. I thought your evidence quite rightly dealt with state-owned enterprises. I'm concerned with illicit trading in general, illicit financial flows. We came across a great deal of evidence of illicit mining, and I'm not talking about foreign nationals staking in underground, I'm talking about illicit platinum mining. So would you say that what you found out about state capture by a kitchen cabinet has spawned these lawless activities across the country?
I don't know enough about illicit trading to be able to comment specifically on that causality. What I would be surprised by is if that illicit trade in finance is something new. So I think there has been, especially from the mid-1980s, mid-1980s represents the introduction in South Africa of the National Security Management System under P.W. Botha. It is the elevation of the security and military apparatuses in government, the weakening of public administrations, whether it's in tax, whether it's in civilian administrations. And it's in those spaces where academics looking at the apartheid period have argued that, including Henny van Vuuren, for example, their book identifies that the real large-scale corruption of the apartheid period begins from the mid-1980s. And it's in the context of sanctions busting, and it's in the context of this national security, of the total onslaught strategy. And I think it's in that context, starting in the mid-1980s, that the general atmosphere for illicit trade, for general corruption in the private sector really starts to take off. I think that during the 1970s it's much more better regulated, but it's a feature of the weakening of state administration starting in the mid-1980s that really gets these patterns of illicit trade moving. Yeah.
I would have ordinarily said I have no questions, simply have congratulated you and expressed my gratitude for really the apart from the concrete, the theoretical broad conception of the way in which state capture in fact happens. But my colleagues' questions sadly give rise for some more to you. My colleague on the left asked you about parliamentary committees, and you answered it quite rightly. Would you also agree, though, that in a system like this, where the majority party, with the majority whip system and being obliged to abide by the resolutions of the party, does create complications for committees whose majority would be the ruling party to question too seriously these matters in relation to the hierarchy and in relation to the instructions which they may have to follow from their political parties. In other words, the determination of whether as a committee member you follow the constitutional injunction to uphold the Constitution at all costs, or whether you obey your political party, does create a bit of a conundrum.
I would agree. I mean, and we see that playing itself out in the 1990s, especially around SCOPA. The weakening of SCOPA in Parliament was directly a feature of it neutering its power in relationship to the power of the party. And I think there again it was this idea that the role of MPs is to serve their party rather than to serve the Constitution. Because I think this idea of serving the Constitution as an MP has been a very abstract one, and the idea of serving your party has a certain idea of certain ability even. Remember what Jacob Zuma has constantly said is that he serves the ANC before he serves the country. And I think it's not a peculiarity of the president. I think it's part of a political culture, not just of the ANC, but also of other political parties, that the role of the MPs is first and foremost to deliver on, to serve their political organizations. I think, though, that's beginning to change. So I think we started to see a change in the SABC Parliamentary Commission, for example, where including ANC MPs played a very vigorous role in holding officials to account. And I think therefore it was the beginning of MPs to understand that their role is yes to their parties, but primarily it's to their constitution beginning to take hold. And I think we are in a space, I hope it lasts a very long time, where that sense of democratic spirit is potentially returning to Parliament, and that's what I'd hope.
You may forgive the expression, but I think you will agree that things had to get absolutely bad to the extent where they could probably be described as vulgar before these changes actually came about.
I think I would agree with you. I think that this is the important role of this sort of tribunal and the role of civil society organization and of the courts and of yourselves, is that we don't allow the situation to degenerate into further vulgarity. And I think there's a small opening, and I think we have to defend that opening very vigorously.
And then my colleague on my right has also given me some extra work, for which I forgive her. You mentioned the property clause, which provides for expropriation. This signals a very interesting corruption, which has little, I think, to do with state capture, though in a sense it might. And I want your comment on it, please. The property clause provides for expropriation on the basis of just and equitable compensation, with the time and manner of compensation being calculated, taking into account a whole range of circumstances. Market value is one of them, but the history of the acquisition of the property, the purpose for which the property has been taken, and so on, are all factors, and it is inevitable that just and equitable compensation taken together with the manner of compensation would mean that government would have to pay less for the property under just and equitable compensation than if it had to pay market value. And therefore reconstruction would have been much, much cheaper. The problem is that for the first almost 20 odd years of its reign, the government has kept market value intact. Now I wonder how you would respond to this proposition, and maybe a kind of state capture thing, that if you get compensation, you pay compensation market value, then there is a greater possibility to skim money from the top. Whereas if you negotiate just and equitable compensation properly and tightly, then quite obviously there's little money to skim from the top. In other words, the money, just and equitable money, doesn't have to be purified, but ultimately market value money has to be purified, otherwise it's a little dirty, you understand. The filtration process has to take place. Now, I wonder whether you'd comment on this and whether there is something else.
I mean, I think
one would have thought, I'll finish in a minute. One would have thought if government argued with property owners hard about and tried to pay as little compensation as they could, there would have been at least one court case up to now where there was a serious dispute about how much money should be paid in terms of just and equitable compensation or market value. And to me, the fact that there hasn't been a single such case, that all these values, or almost all of them, have been settled, says something very important to us.
I mean, I think you put forward a highly compelling hypothesis that deserves to be researched. What makes it even more surprising is that I know of several initiatives, including one which is highly developed, an offer by large organized Western Cape farmers to give up 30% of their productive land to new black farmers, with a whole incentives around mentoring them, etc. And I think I've seen various assessments of that offer. It's compelling, and it's a real offer, which has met government resistance. So it's never been taken up on. It's very difficult to understand why. So I think you put your finger on a dynamic which definitely deserves to be explored. I certainly haven't done that. I haven't done that work. I don't know if it has been done elsewhere, but I think it's something which we should look further into.
So my other colleagues' questions require nothing of me. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Now, what are you going to do in the next 6 minutes? What do you say? Shall we start our comfort a bit early and come back a bit early. Ms. Evidence Leader.
Sorry, Chair. We can go to tea. We have nothing further until the presentations by civil society after tea.